All right, so we've already started with progressivism, and now we're going to actually look at the presidents who served in the White House. And the thing we want to keep in mind is that these progressive presidents really do return the power of government back to the executive branch. Really, ever since Lincoln, power had been pushed back to Congress. All right, and there's a series we mentioned before of forgettable presidents that more or less have no bearing on what Congress is doing. Big business is controlling Congress, and therefore the presidency doesn't even necessarily matter that much. But Teddy Roosevelt really rips, kind of a snag in that system and resets it back to the executive being very, very powerful. So Teddy, my favorite president, is also the most important progressive president. He was never intended to be president. He was the governor of New York and had served a few other jobs, but was put on the ticket as vice president under McKinley in 1900 in order to get support. Roosevelt is incredibly popular for being a war hero. Okay, he's very outspoken. He's also seen as reckless and dangerous to the Republican Party. So no one really wants him to run for president, but they do want him to kind of give a bump of popularity to the otherwise drab McKinley. McKinley will be assassinated in 1901, and Roosevelt will assume the presidency. So, this isn't how Trump got the power. Obviously, Trump was elected, but his recklessness and dangers to an established party is very similar to Trump. I actually remember when Trump was running and the Republican Party was like, we don't know what to do with him. It really reminded me of Teddy Roosevelt, actually, just for different reasons. And he uses the White House as what we call a bully pulpit, right? And he, like I said, is going to move power from the big business back to the people, because the people vote for presidency, right? So big business will be scaled down in its power. He's the youngest president ever, all right, when he becomes president. He's 42 years old. He's incredibly energetic, incredibly accomplished. Look at this list. He graduated with honors from Harvard, wrote 23 books. He was an authority on North American wildlife. He was a prize-fighting championship finalist, which is boxing. He's a cowboy. He's a socialite. So he's incredibly accomplished. He comes from a background, though, where actually he was raised as very, very small, weak, asthmatic, had poor eyesight. But he dedicates himself to improvement, to physical fitness, and actually ends up entering college in very good physical shape. And he always kind of presses that as an ideal, is to be completely fit as possible. His wife, Alice Hathaway Lee, dies in childbirth, actually the same day as his mother, which is really sad. And he actually vacates and goes to North Dakota, all right, for a time period. And, he actually basically just, retracts himself from society, all right. And let me see if I can find his ranch here. Elkhorn Ranch. So Elkhorn Ranch will be the area now in the Black the Black Hills area, sorry, the Badlands, where actually we have a national park now, Theodore Roosevelt National Park. But Elkhorn Ranch will be the place that he actually goes for kind of his retreat, right? So that will be, I'll go ahead and ask you that as our fourth quiz question. Where did Teddy Roosevelt go, right, after his wife dies? And it's going to be the Elkhorn Ranch, okay? Elkhorn Ranch will be quiz question number 4. Anyway, 42. There we go. So, anyway, after he returns, though, he'll re-enter the public sphere. He'll become the police commissioner of New York City, and then later the assistant secretary of the Navy, okay? He'll also volunteer and raise a regiment known as the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, which we'll get to in a little bit here, all right? And this regiment is known as kind of being lawless, brave, though, courageous, and whipping up on the Spanish troops down in Cuba. In Congress, many are worried about Roosevelt. They don't know what to do with him. Congress controls the government. Big business controls Congress. So Roosevelt is not seen as a welcome addition to the government. But, Roosevelt isn't looking to necessarily push the government towards socialism. He says capitalism is fine, but it needs to be restrained with common sense, right? And actually we see this today. Capitalist systems are generally the best, but with restraint and some government regulation, okay? He goes everywhere with his own photographer to show Americans that he isn't afraid to get his hands dirty and that he is energetic. He travels outside the country regularly and also won the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the peace deal between the Russians and the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And overall, the major movement that he takes is moving power to the presidency or back to the White House, but based on the people. Now, his role as an enemy of sorts to big business comes from the fact that he uses his power as executive to break up monopolies. He criticizes the wealthy class often and very vigorously, even though he is from that class. And he attacks on two fronts. He says that the exploitation of the poor could result in a violent uprising, like what we'll see with the Bolsheviks later in Russia. And he thinks that the captains of industry, the industrialists, see themselves as superior to government, and Roosevelt won't stand for that. And so what he uses is an act already in place, the Sherman Antitrust Act that was passed in 1890, to make it illegal to restrain trade. Okay, this act had been rarely used before in courts and was known as the paper tiger. But Roosevelt, in his custom brashness, will attack a company that's owned by J.P. Morgan, the Northern Securities Railroad. And he thinks that this railroad is violating trade, so it's broken up, and it passes with a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court. So it was seen as legal that Roosevelt can break up a business that he thinks is limiting trade. He doesn't want to break up all the companies. He only wants to break up bad trusts, right? So if a trust is reasonable, it'll be left alone, right? The problem with this is that it's somewhat subjective, right? The president will be left with the moral decision, because it is a moral decision, right? Good or bad, right? About who would be left as a company, be left alone, and who would be broken up, right? So there's a lot of power that's given to the executive, right? And I hope you can see, this is the executive making these decisions, not Congress. Teddy will also move towards labor, okay, and increasing the rights of labor unions. Governments before had sought to limit the power of labor unions by using federal troops to put down strikes. But in 1902, when the Pennsylvania coal miners went on strike, the story is going to be a lot different. Okay, these mine workers, led by a guy by the name of John Mitchell, sought to get better wages, shorter hours, and recognition of the union. Right, recognition that the union was legal and had the right to bargain. The owners, all right, and this was led by a man by the name of George Bear, refused, and we see 114,000 miners going on strike. Roosevelt steps in the midst of the strike. He invites both men to the White House. Bear refused to come, and Roosevelt's pissed. He likes Mitchell. He's impressed, and he's super angry, and kind of his suspicions that industrialists think they're above the government is confirmed through Bear's refusal to come to the White House to even broker a deal. Roosevelt threatens to seize the mines, all right, and allow public access to the coal. He has no constitutional authority to do so, but he just threatens it anyway. He's got an army, of course. Eventually, Bear and the companies will back in. Miners get a 10% pay increase. The workday is reduced to 8 or 9 hours. But the owners do not have to recognize this new union, the United Mine Workers Union. So, there is compromise struck here, but this is really shocking that a president would use federal troops to threaten to seize a corporation's assets for the benefit of the workers, right? This is completely new. And it's amazing how successful it is with increasing the rights of workers in unions. All right, the next part we want to talk about is preserving natural areas. Okay, and I love this quote by Teddy here. He says that the establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration, of the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and of the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. So this whole story, conservation, the idea of beauty being a national asset, all of that's new. Before, nature was seen as a place to struggle. Wilderness was a place you wanted to conquer. But now, at the turn of the 20th century, nature is seen as a place for rest and beauty and relaxation, and sharpening you as a man, or really as a human being in general. So many are going to look to the wilderness as a place of unchanging beauty and unchanging wildness, right? And if anything, to create new wild areas. America was growing enormously. We were destroying our natural resources, though. Farmers were overworking soil, miners created erosion, there's huge deforestation, depletion of wildlife. So we have organizations like the Sierra Club, formed in 1892 by a guy by the name of John Muir, to preserve these public lands, right? Make sure that these lands weren't sold to private developers. No one cared about him at all until Teddy Roosevelt took over the White House and actually became very good friends with him. Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman. He would frequent, Field and Stream or Bass Pro Shop today, I'm sure. Hunted, hiked, camped whenever he could. Of course, like I mentioned before, when his wife dies, he goes to North Dakota to hunt, right, and basically withdraw. And what he does is protect lands on a scale that are absolutely unfathomable. Okay, there is another piece of legislation already in place when he becomes president, the Newlands Reclamation Act, and this said that developers and homesteaders, right, could develop lands, right, that were useless without irrigation. The catch was that the person who bought the land had to provide the cost of irrigation, and then the government could use those funds to irrigate other lands. So this whole act, the implementation of this act, was basically had an amazing benefit to make the plains fertile. All of a sudden, this high desert plains area could become a major food growing area, and so you wouldn't need to necessarily move into pristine, beautiful natural areas to farm or do whatever. 1903, Roosevelt and his friend John Muir go camping in Yosemite. In Yosemite, by the way, I'll get a little picture here. Yosemite is the location of Half Dome, right? Maybe you've heard of that before. I'll show you a picture of that. Half Dome is probably the most iconic. I love topo maps, by the way. The most iconic mountain, maybe photograph in the United States. Here it is. Half Dome. There's right there. And there's a rock face, a very famous rock face right here, known as El Capitan. So that'll be your 5th quiz question. What is the name of the rock face on Half Dome? And that is El Capitan. Okay. Anyway, to finish up the notes, let's do it. He goes camping, and this is only a couple years after he becomes president. Muir convinces him to preserve areas as wilderness. And so for the first time ever, we see a president preserving natural areas as federal lands. He's going to end up preserving close to 150 million acres as national forests, right? Which is insane. Okay, Congress passed a law in 1907 barring him from protecting any more lands in the West, in 6 western states. But before the law is passed, he is able to protect an extra 16 million acres. So by 1913, there are 16 national parks, 300,000 annual visitors. Now the national parks number almost over 100. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are also going to be formed at this time period to provide an outlet for education for new generations to enjoy the outdoors. Now, Roosevelt leaves office in 1908. There's a financial panic that had happened just before, and many are blaming Roosevelt on this panic. Congress, which is still conservative and led by the Republicans, gets more antagonistic and blocks a lot of his initiatives, including the 1907 National Parks blocking bill. And, there's no law yet preventing somebody from running for a 3rd term, but, based on precedent set by George Washington, he says he's not going to run again. What he does do is pick a successor, and this is William Howard Taft. Taft is Roosevelt's best friend. He's Secretary of War, and as a result of Roosevelt's endorsement, who was very popular with the people, Taft wins an enormous victory over William Jennings Bryan, the same guy who was running as a populist in 1896. Roosevelt, though, after leaving office, goes abroad into Europe and Africa. Taft is left on his own to figure out the presidency. He's not as skilled as Roosevelt, right? He alienates different groups. He isn't as good at pulling people together. And as a result, there's this perspective that he's not doing a very good job. He passes a tariff that people hate. He appointed, a new leader of the forestry department and fired Gifford Pinchot. And it was, Pinchot was widely regarded as one of the nation's top conservationists. So some of his decisions were a little bit dubious, but he was kind of unfairly criticized. Taft did amazing things in office. 2 times as many trusts were broken up, all right, as when Roosevelt was there. He limited the workday for federal employees to 8 hours. He supported the 16th and 17th Amendments and even created a Children's Bureau to look at child labor laws. So he's very active and actually does, in some ways, a lot more than Roosevelt. But he's very, very harshly criticized because he's kind of more abrasive and doesn't have the political skill that Roosevelt had. As a result, Roosevelt, thinks that Taft is not a very good president, and actually will end up running against him again in the 1912 election. Okay, Roosevelt felt that Taft betrayed the progressive platform. All right, but some other historians think that Roosevelt is a megalomaniac. He's lustful for power and hated being away from office. So, many historians judge Roosevelt harshly and think he stabbed his best friend in the back and ignored some of these great accomplishments that Taft made while in office. But anyway, in 1912, Roosevelt and Taft will run against each other. Okay, Taft will have the party leadership, but Roosevelt will have the people. And basically what will happen is Roosevelt splits the Republican Party, even though he runs for the Progressive Party, and allows Woodrow Wilson to win. Okay, the platform, though, of Roosevelt is pretty amazing and way ahead of its time. He said that if he would win, he would implement this new program known as New Nationalism, which included creation of a Federal Trade Commission, a minimum wage, workers' compensation laws, a child labor law, and pensions for retirees. Okay, Woodrow Wilson is going to be the one that runs against him. He's the ex-president of Princeton University and a Southerner. He was also the governor of New Jersey, and his platform for change was known as the New Freedom, that attacked what we call the triple wall of privilege: the tariff, banks, and the trusts. Okay, so notice how these are some of the same things that Republicans want to attack too, but he's a Democrat. Okay, so anyway, I wrote this wrong. Taft does not end up winning. Wilson ends up winning in 1912 because Roosevelt splits the Republican Party. And as a result, instead of having Roosevelt or Taft as presidents when World War I breaks out, we have Wilson, which does an incredible job first of keeping us out of the war, and then a great job of helping the war to end. All right, so you can read this right here. This is what Woodrow Wilson does to attack the triple wall of privilege. It's kind of boring stuff, so I'm not going to necessarily talk about it in detail. But this is the story of the progressive era. We did it very, very quickly, right? But a lot's changing. The fabric of America and the power of the executive will never be the same. Good luck with your questions. Let me know if you need anything. Thanks.